That means it works. Okay. All right. So. Yep. Do the 1, 2, 3. All right. So we'll get started here. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Aiden Labella. I am a member of this club. I'm a 5th year computer science undergraduate student, and I'm also a research assistant in the lab I'm going to talk about, which is the Distributed Data Science Systems Lab at RIT. And then starting in the fall, I will also be a PhD student in the Department of Computer Science at Brown University. Exciting. So for a little bit of an overview, I'll talk first about like who we are, what we do, and then I'll talk about the NGAFID project, which is kind of like our big gold mine of data, as we call it. And I'll talk about some data mining things we've done with that, which is stall indices and predictive maintenance. And then after that, I'll introduce Josh, who will talk more about the neuro-evolutionary algorithm side of things. So who are we? We are a lab group here in GCCIS. We have all 3 types of degrees, so PhD, MS, and BS students in our lab. And our advisor, Dr. Travis DeSalle, he's an associate professor in the Department of Software Engineering, but also the director of the Master's in Data Science program as well. He's our advisor. And so he, tells us what to do. But so on that note of what do we do? Well, we currently have 3 main projects. So the first one, and this is kind of going to be what I talk about, is the National General Aviation Flight Information Database, called the NGAFID for short, and that's what I'll refer to it as throughout the presentation, because the latter or the former is a mouthful. And we collaborate with the University of North Dakota Grand Forks on this project. I'll also talk, I'll mention the evolutionary exploration of neural networks framework, which is also known as EXAMM. Actually, Josh will talk about that. And then more recently, in the past semester, we've added machine learning for unmanned aerial systems. One of our PhD students is working hard on that. Okay. So like I said, the National General Aviation Flight Information Database, the NGAFID, is basically a database with a graphical front end for flight institutions across the country and private pilots across the US. So it turns out that actually one of our largest users is the University of North Dakota. They are the ones who we collaborate with. And so they are main contributor of the data. And people who use the NGAFID primarily want to use it for reasons like safety analysis, flight data monitoring, for safety events, which we call exceedances. That's really the main focus of the NGAFID, is to look for things that are anomalous in flight data to further improve the way pilots fly.
If you want to hide this,
Yeah,
you
can I?
You can go to more, and there should be so there
Jeez.
hide
Floating meeting controls. There we go. Sorry about that. All right. So where was I? Okay, yeah, events. So yeah, like I said, NGAFID main focus is really event detection, right? So a good example is low fuel, right? So this is an example of sort of a readout of events we get from a flight. As you can see, we've got low fuel here. This is when basically what happens is the fuel gets below a certain level, and it's something that pilots want to know about, and the institution that they fly for wants. Yeah, just so that they don't run out of fuel the next time, right? As you can see, we've also got high pitch roll, just to give you an idea of some other things we do. And so what's nice about the NGAFID and the way it's designed is actually that the way that we find these events is generic. We store everything as a multivariate time series object. And what we do is we loop over this multivariate time series, right? So we have different columns for different parameters, and we're able to look at each parameter individually and see if at any given point in time, it exceeded a critical value. So here's a good example right here on this graph. I've got 2 readouts of speeds. One's CAS, which I believe is calibrated airspeed, and then IAS is indicated airspeed. The point where it's highlighted is where it exceeded the value that it was that the institution, in this case, UND, North Dakota, defined was unsafe. So the thing is that unfortunately we're kind of limited a little bit in this approach. So there are other events that we really need to look for, right? And one of those is aerodynamic stalls. An aerodynamic stall is very dangerous. It's when an aircraft essentially loses lift, exceeds a critical angle of attack, which is basically just a physics term for the angle of air going over your wing. And if you look at this kind of the apex of this curve here, that's where the stall begins, right? And from there is kind of like a danger zone. Obviously a situation that pilots don't want to get into, but it's regularly practiced as part of student pilots training so that they know how to get out of it in case that they do ever encounter it. So in fact, we actually have lots of examples in our data of student pilots practicing this. Now it should also be mentioned that loss of control in flight is even worse. It can stem from stall situation. And it's essentially when you have an, the FAA calls an unintended departure of aircraft from controlled flight. As the name says, you lose control of your aircraft, and it's actually the leading cause of general aviation accidents in the US, with I think one happening every 4 days. This is not to be confused with general or commercial aviation, which is much safer, with I think only one fatal accident occurring in the last 10 years. So how can we kind of figure out where these stalls and loss of control events are happening? Well, turns out someone actually already has work for a mathematical method to figure out what's the likelihood of entering a stall or loss control event is. And that's this big equation down here. I won't get into the specifics of it, but basically it measures, it's a way for us to calculate the angle of attack and then see how close that is to the critical angle of attack value where a aircraft would enter a stall. And so we were able to use this for a bit of an implementation in the NGAFID. We basically ran this over all of our time series data for an experimental set of flights, and we're able to see that, hey, it works. And on top of that, we actually had someone at Liberty University down in Virginia do a test flight for us. So they went out, they flew around, did performed a bunch of maneuvers that they had pre-planned so that they could sort of use this as a ground truth. And from there, we were able to kind of validate the fact that this model works, right? That the equation actually can predict stall and loss control events, right? So if you look here at the flight path, the way we have it implemented is that green means the stall or loss control index, so the probability is in a good range. Flight is safe, everything's normal. As it approaches red, you're more likely to hit a stall. And that's where actually the brown event, the brown little highlights on top of the flight path indicates somewhere where we've detected with that generic algorithm actually that there's been a stall for sure. Like we're like almost 99% positive a stall happened here because the critical angle of attack was so high, or the angle of attack was so close to the critical value. So yeah, we actually kind of polished this up a little bit and we're able to fine tune this using some things like we derive vertical speed instead due to the fact that the onboard vertical speed on the aircraft is a bit lagged. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, that's really the vertical speed is just how fast up or down the aircraft is going. And so that's a little bit lagged for most aircraft in this situation. So we kind of changed that a bit. And then we also implemented a true airspeed calculation for lower speeds, which is defined by Cessna, the manufacturer of the aircraft. And that helped improve the accuracy. It wasn't necessarily the accuracy of the index itself, but the accuracy of when the index was registering, right? So we saw a slight delay, but we were able to rectify that with those approaches, right? All right, so I'll actually move on now to predictive maintenance. I think we're doing good on time. So what is predictive maintenance, right? Just as the name suggests, we can predict when an aircraft needs mechanical maintenance based on data from the aircraft's components, right? So that's your engine, propeller, battery, etc. Just like in your car, there's a lot of moving components in a small Cessna like this. And what we can do is we can train models based on the multivariate time series objects we get from NGAFID data to predict or sort of output a probability that an aircraft needs maintenance or has already had maintenance, right? And so that's what this next slide is for. This is, I'm sure most of you in this room know what a convolutional neural network is. We explored one that uses transformers on top of that and allows for a single output from the input data, which again, kind of like an image, 4096 by 23, it's sort of like an image. There's no channels or anything, but if you were to picture it, it would look like a very narrow image. And in fact, Hong, the author of this paper, if you were to read the original work, has little visualizations for like how they look when they go into the model, which is pretty cool. So we proposed this architecture, we tested it out, implemented it, and we actually had found that compared to some existing architectures with both recurrent neural networks and convolutional models and combinations of the two, you can combine both of them in some ways. We were actually able to outperform most, if not all of them. And one nice thing we did, sort of more on the software engineering side of things, is we implemented a way to add the probability or the what the model thought of a flight after, like, after the fact, obviously, right into the NGAFID. So we kind of use the same green to red gradient, red meaning, it's a high probability that it needs maintenance, with green meaning it low probability, right? Okay, and lastly, before I hand it over to Josh, just in case anyone's interested, we're actually looking for undergraduate research assistants in our lab, the D2S2 lab, primarily for Golisano students in computer science, software engineering, with a good knowledge of object-oriented programming, particularly Java, JavaScript, and then C++ if you want to go over and do some Neuro-Evolution type things. All this really would entail is just attending weekly lab meetings. I've been doing it for about 3 years now. It's a great gig. And it's, you get to meet a lot of interesting people. Even get to go to conferences. I got to go to a conference back in November, which was nice. I would have gone to more had there not been COVID, but yeah. So if you are interested, just contact me or Travis, Dr. DeSalle. And I think these are my references. Yeah, the NGAFID is open source. You can check it out. And I guess I'll hand it over to Josh now, who's going to talk about neural architecture search, evolutionary algorithms.
Yeah, we got a two-parter for you here, folks. Okay, hi everyone. I'm a PhD student. I'm finishing up my 4th year, which doesn't feel correct coming out of my mouth, but anyways. So a lot of my work has to do with a problem known as neural architecture search and using evolutionary algorithms in particular to approach it. So neural architecture search is a subproblem of AutoML. AutoML is generally the concept of like a fully automated end-to-end machine learning framework where there's effectively no human intervention whatsoever. And the problem statement for neural architecture search is pretty trivial. So you have a given input data set and then some like outputs or labels. We want to know what is the best neural architecture to explain that data set or whatever, to minimize whatever objective function it is that you're using. So very simple problem statement, and there's a very simple solution to it. Here it is, guys. We evaluate every single possible neural network, and it's guaranteed to give the best result. The unfortunate thing here is this is completely intractable. So there's a whole field of study dedicated to figuring out where we can sort of sacrifice perfection for a realistic runtime. And there's 3 main places where people sort of tweak the algorithm. So the search space, that's what networks are up for consideration. You can either do, the space of all possible neural networks. That's pretty intractable. One common search space is like layer-based networks where it's just one operation after another. There's other ones that are a little more complicated, but hopefully you get the idea. The search strategy, that is basically how the search space is traversed. You can use a whole bunch of different algorithms to do that. I'm going to talk about a couple of them. And then the performance estimation strategy, that's how you evaluate how good a candidate neural architecture is. This is generally speaking the most expensive part of the algorithm because it can involve training with backpropagation. So like training with backpropagation and then evaluating things on like a validation data set, that's pretty common and that's pretty damn expensive, especially if you want to get an actual good performance metric. So you're actually calculating the error on a pretty large data set. So yeah, these are the three primary pieces. So common search strategies. Reinforcement learning seems to be like the most common one I see. I don't know anything about reinforcement learning. Don't talk to me about it. Differential neural architecture search, that is becoming more popular. That's where you parameterize the search space into a set of differentiable weights that can be trained using stochastic gradient descent along with the like regular weights. So you can just have like this one huge model that contains everything you could possibly want or want to consider. And that whole thing is your search space. And then you just train it. And at the end, you pull out the most probable learned model. And you get, that's your model, that's your output. Bayesian methods are kind of similar to that, but I don't know a whole lot about that. But basically learning the most probable network using like statistical methods like Monte Carlo sampling, stuff like that. And then there is evolutionary algorithms, and that's what I've been toying around with for the past 4 years. Evolutionary algorithms are algorithms that mimic natural evolution. So mutation introduces new traits into population, crossover maintains genetic diversity, and selection gets rid of poorly performing individuals. You have to somehow parameterize your solution, so to speak, your candidate solution or genome, as we call it. In the case of neural architecture search, the most common thing to do is just use the architecture, and then you can like tweak it. So if you add a new like convolution node or something, it's just there, that's it. So I have some pictures that'll actually make that make a little bit of sense. But yeah, mimicking natural evolution, natural selection, blah, blah, blah. So the specific algorithm that I've been messing around with for the past couple of years is called EXAMM, the evolutionary exploration of augmenting memory models. Evolutionary algorithms applied to neural architecture search is often referred to as neuro-evolution in the literature. This algorithm in particular involves recurrent neural networks for time series regression tasks, i.e. The NGAFID flight data. We also have another data set that we use. That's another source of funding that comes from like a coal-fired power plant. And yeah, this thing evolves networks at the node and edge level. How many of you took Travis's like neural networks class?
Neural networks.
Those? So lame, what the hell? You guys got it. You should take that if you get the chance. It's really good. Okay, so this is like high level overview of like how the actual algorithm works. It's an asynchronous distributed algorithm. So we have like master manager who like maintains a population of neural networks and sends tasks off to a whole bunch of workers. All the workers do is request a task or a genome. The manager generates a genome, the worker receives it, the worker trains it and calculates its performance, mean squared error on a validation data set usually. And the worker sends that back to the manager who will attempt to insert it into the population. It'll get inserted into the population if it did better than the worst thing in there. If not, it gets thrown in the garbage. So the actual genomes, again, they're just networks. The nodes can be like normal neural network cells or like RNN memory cells, like LSTMs, GRUs. And the edges can be normal or recurrent edges. So as far as like mutations, so how this network could possibly be modified, there's two different like categories of mutations, the edge mutations and the node mutations. So we can add, enable, split, or disable an edge, or add, split, merge, enable, or disable a node. And again, I'm not going too deep into it because it's not really that important, but the actual networks that this thing generates are pretty like wild and ridiculous looking, especially if you've seen any like, I don't know, state-of-the-art models that get used for like image classification tasks. It's all like skip connections and layer-based stuff. This is pretty ridiculous, and this is a really small one, and even then it's really ridiculous. So this ridiculous look, we also just call it organic looking. What is it? So one of the really cool experiments we did with EXAMM a couple years ago was an empirical study looking into the effects of deep recurrent connections in memory cells on the performance of our networks. Deep recurrent connections is like some term my advisor made up to refer to recurrent connections that go back more than one time step. So more than one time step back. So during this, what is it? All the experiments we did for this paper required us to evaluate 10 million RNNs, and there was 5,000 separate experiments. And the really cool finding from this was that these deep recurrent connections consistently improve the performance on all 4 of the different data sets that we evaluated. And we think it's because that just, what is it? The connections that go back more than one time step have less opportunities to have their like gradients reduced during back propagation. I don't know if any of you know about the vanishing gradient problem with stochastic, back propagation through time, but this pretty much addresses that, or at least that's the theory. And then this is like the main results table. I'm not going to go through it because that would be ridiculous, but just to give you like an idea of like how many different experiments we were doing, every single one of those was repeated like 20 times, I think. So there was a whole lot going on here. And then this was another cool experiment we did. So we have all this aircraft data for a whole bunch of different types of aircraft. So what we did was we adapted networks trained on one type of aircraft to another type of aircraft, and then let Neuro-Evolution sort of fill in the cracks. And we repeated this on, so if we had 3 types of aircraft and we did it on all permutations of like A to B, A to C, B to A, B to C, C to A, C to B. So 6 different experimental groups. And the experiments found that the networks trained significantly faster and achieved superior performance, which is not very surprising because like the networks roughly have to learn the same thing. The different aircrafts are relatively similar. And then this is a graph that just shows the mean squared error as like the evolution continued. And that orange bar is the one that used transfer learning and inherited the weights from the previous experiments. And that thing shot down really, really, really quick, unsurprisingly. Transfer learning is like a pretty well-known thing at this point. So what is it? Some current research directions that I'm looking at. So I mentioned that like we can add nodes to our networks as one of the possible mutations. But when we add a node, since we have like 5 different memory cells we could use, we have to make a choice. Right now, we just randomly select them uniformly. But instead of doing that, which kind of increases the difficulty of the search, we can select them all and learn the best choice with a stochastic gradient descent. So the differential neural architecture search thing that I mentioned earlier, I'm trying to like integrate that into EXAMM to sort of reduce the burden placed on the evolutionary search. What is it? This is like softmax, blah, blah, blah. So we use we approximate a categorical distribution with something called the Gumbel softmax distribution. We have a vector pi, which is like the weights for this thing. G is just some noise that you need when you're sampling it because it's a probability distribution. And T is a temperature, which is a parameter that I'll sort of demonstrate the impacts of in the next slide. So yeah, during the forward pass, these Y values would be used to calculate a weighted mean of all of the options. So in the case of like the memory cells, we have 5 memory cells. we calculate a weighted mean of the outputs of all 5 memory cells. And so here's the temperature. As it gets annealed to 0 on the far right there, that's like a pretty high temperature value where there's not really a lot of information in the distribution. It's high in entropy. And as we get closer and closer to 0, the samples effectively begin to resemble those from a categorical distribution. So yeah, after some time, the cell with the largest corresponding pi value can be selected as the winner, but defining like some time is actually quite difficult, and determining criteria for determining a winner is also quite difficult. And it's made particularly difficult because this is happening in the context of an evolutionary search, and there's not a lot of literature for me to go off of. So this is just what I'm like toying around with these days. And then honorable mentions for things that you guys might find interesting. We used ant colony optimization to find RNN architectures where we like simulate the behavior of ants following like pheromone trails on like walking down the edges on a neural network to optimize RNN architecture. And then what is it? An undergrad, like 2 years ago, I think, used reinforcement learning to optimize a bunch of the hyperparameters of EXAMM in real time, which was also pretty cool. And he published a paper on that. And then here's a bunch of references. If you are interested in any of them, I think you can probably send the slides in the Discord, right?
Yeah.
Yep. All right. That was really it. So I just wanted to give you guys an overview of what our lab's sort of been doing the past couple of years. I hope it wasn't super completely boring. Yeah, I guess that's it.
Thank you, the right crowd. Questions, Brian?
Anyone?
So I had a question of the NGAFID portion of it. So the
Okay.
input into your model, that's a bunch of sensor readings, right? That's
Yep.
from your time series.
Yep. Yeah, so the input, the 4096 by 23, if I go back to that. Here. Yeah, so that's 4,096 time steps and 23 sensor readings. Right. The other way around would be kind of crazy,
Yeah.
right?
So I guess one of the limitations of this is that it can only be applied to flights on like a fixed amount of
Yep.
time.
Yeah, that's a problem with CNNs. To get around that, usually you just use padding, right? So
And then times of like seconds, minutes.
seconds, it's 1 hertz. So that's another thing. Then it's funny because one talk that we're kind of having with some of the project stakeholders in the NGAFID is bumping up like the frequency of recording things. There's some people down at Georgia Tech that are interested in doing that. But then again, that means more data, more time steps, because you have maybe, I don't know, 60 time steps a second, right? So that increases your data size, which is good. You can probably have more accuracy. But for the time being, we just have 1 hertz, 1 second every time step.
So it's pretty low fidelity data, which is like why a lot of those analyses are actually like pretty difficult to tune down. A lot of false positives.
Yeah, it's noisy, and we're actually kind of working. We actually just had a meeting today, Josh and I, where we're kind of working on figuring out where bad data is with RNNs. So
You have to do what is moving.
well, no, we don't really do any of that. We of course do normalization before we feed anything in. That's a big one. I've made that mistake a few times of not doing that and being like, why won't you train? But it's yeah, really for that approach, what we're trying to figure out like where the bad data is. It's more or less figuring out like if the RNN's predicting it should be this, and the real data we have is like this, then we have an issue, error, right? And the Zymank's kind of working on that too, right? So
The current theory is we have an ensemble of models and all of their predictions are all over the place.
yep, exactly.
It's probably shitty data. Something's
Yeah,
wrong.
that's one. Yeah, if you have a bunch of models and they're all over the place, that's one of them. And then the other is just, of course, looking at the difference between what the RNN is outputting and what is actually being fed, which is,
Yep.
So,
Anyways,
yep.
I had one question about the exam part. So you're saying like adding all possible nodes, so adding one.
oh,
Yeah, do you mean adding one and then checking his accuracy? and
No,
adding
no,
the
no,
next
no,
one?
no. So specifically what I mean is I'm like adding like a special compound node that internally has LSTM, GRU, delta
Oh.
node, UGRNM, and then a simple recurrent node. It has all of those inside of it. So during the forward pass, each one of them is evaluated with the same input. They have their own weights that they learn individually, but then I calculate this like weighted sum that comes from like a probability distribution that a bunch of nerds like know a whole lot about.
Yeah.
So that's how that works. I don't know if it works though. I'd like to figure it out if it works. I might be able to get a PhD if it does. Believe it or not.
Has everything.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
The networks that exam usually generates are like teeny tiny,
Yeah.
like 40 weights, like nothing.
Yep.
But with these compound nodes, it's like, hundreds of times larger, which is kind of funny.
So are those small models like sufficient for like your? like,
Yeah,
galaxy?
this problem's, it's such an easy problem. I mean, that's.
The
more than
coal stuff
sufficient.
especially, right? The coal stuff is pretty,
Yeah, but yeah, time series regression tasks are pretty.
right?
pretty simple.
Yeah, I will add that like, especially with predictive maintenance, engine data and like, I think the coal data is like this too. It's not very organic in nature. It's quite defined. So the analogy I like to use is if you look at the needle in your car for your like coolant temperature, it stays around the same. You can predict what it's going to do. Like I know where my engine's warm. I know that it takes me a few blocks to where it should be this, right? That's pretty organic, but how fast I'm going,
Yeah.
that stuff with aviation, that's very dependent on other factors. So that stuff's a little bit easier to deal with, both with like non-ML methods and ML methods.
So ideally, you generalize exams to like handle any architecture search, right?
Ideally.
Ideally.
Yeah, you could, because like the mutations are like add node, add edge, and it's like instead of like on those networks, it's literally like a single floating point value running down those edges. But like you could generalize it, it could be a tensor and it could be flowing into a node with an operation that's like a convolution or a transform or an extension or whatever the hell.
Yeah.
It's all roughly the same stuff. But who knows if it would work very well for that use case? Not me.
Future work. That's for the next-
Yeah,
That's for the
you
next
guys.
bet, yeah.
You guys. is,
Yeah.
You know,
You guys can work for Travis and figure this out.
Yeah,
yeah.
like I said, there's openings. Yeah, if you're so inclined,
That's this PhD.
there's PhD, you can do your PhD in it.
Yeah, it's such an easy gig, guys. Trust me. Huh?
PhD.
No, I'm talking about the research assistant part.
Yeah,
PhD part's pretty easy too. though. Basically, I mean, if you're doing the web dev shit, that's really, really easy. And then if you're doing the exam shit, if you're good at C++, it will be a joke. And if you're not good at C++, never talk to me.
mhm.
But, yeah, the web dev stuff is super easy.
It
So
is,
if you
yeah,
need an
well,
engineer-
if you know JavaScript, it's easy. JavaScript's a pain in the butt to work with, but yes, that the stuff that like the front end stuff, this is all generally pretty trivial. If you have basic knowledge in software engineering, you should be able to.
It's easy. It's a pain in the ass.
Yeah, but it's easy, but it's a pain in the ass. Exactly, right. It's not hard to generate good results like this with that, so. Well, yeah, that's, yep, web dev in general is like that. Do you have any questions in chat or anything?
We had a whole like sequence for neural networks, and this is gonna be like the basically the capstone to that, because he did cover a lot of the topics we went over, but one of the main questions he has like, how do you figure out like which network?
Oh,
your
boy.
architecture?
I'd love to know.
Yeah, yeah.
If you figure it out, hit me up.
Figure out an analytical solution.
Well, every once in a while, someone publishes a paper that has a great network. LeeNet is one of them, so.
It's Lynette, bro.
Linet, I call it LeeNet because we've got Lee here, but
Yeah. Okay.
any other questions?
Questions, thank our guest speakers here.
Thank you, guys.
Clapping and Zoom.
Yeah, we're the clap emotes.
All right, I'm gonna leave the meeting.